Three true unnerving new house horror stories. The mysterious room. A couple had just moved into their new house and were excited to explore their new home. They noticed a locked door in the basement and were curious about what was behind it. They asked the previous owners, but they claimed they didn't know anything about the locked door. One day, they managed to get the key and opened the door. They found a room that was completely empty except for an old rocking chair in the corner. They thought nothing of it and locked the door again. However, they began to notice strange things happening around the house. Doors would open and close on their own, and they would hear creaking sounds coming from the basement. They also noticed that the rocking chair in the mysterious room would move on its own, even though there was no one in the room. They decided to investigate and set up a camera in the room. When they played back the footage, they saw a figure sitting in the rocking chair, rocking back and forth on its own. The couple was terrified and immediately moved out of the house, leaving the mysterious room and its secrets behind. The ghostly laughter. A young family had just moved into their new house and were excited to make it their own. They were especially excited about the large backyard, which their children loved to play in. One night, while the parents were watching TV, they heard the sound of children laughing coming from the backyard. They thought it was their children playing, but when they looked outside, they saw no one there. The laughter continued every night, and they began to notice other strange occurrences in the house. Doors would slam shut on their own, and they could hear footsteps coming from the hallway even when no one was there. They decided to investigate and found out that their new home had a dark history. It used to be an orphanage, and the laughter they heard was the ghostly laughter of the children who had once lived there. The family was terrified and immediately moved out of the house, leaving the ghostly laughter behind. The cursed object. A man had just moved into his new house and was excited to start a new chapter in his life. He noticed an old mirror in the basement that had been left behind by the previous owners. He decided to keep it and hung it up in his bedroom. However, he began to notice strange things happening in his room. He would wake up in the middle of the night to find the mirror glowing and could hear strange whispers coming from it. He soon realized that the mirror was cursed, and the previous owners had left it behind for a reason. He decided to get rid of it, but every time he tried to take it down, he was overcome with a feeling of dread. One night, he woke up to find himself standing in front of the mirror, unable to move. He watched in horror as his reflection began to move on its own, reaching out to grab him. The man was able to break free and immediately got rid of the mirror. However, he continued to feel the presence of the cursed object in his new home and eventually had to move out. Late night ride. Jerry was driving home late one night when he saw a young lady waiting by a bus stop. He stopped his car and told her that he didn't think the buses were running so late at night and offered her a ride. The fall night air was getting chilly, so he took off his jacket and gave it to her. Jerry found out that the girl's name was Mary and she was on her way home. After an hour's drive, they arrived at her home and he dropped her off by the front door. Jerry said goodnight and went home himself. The next day he remembered that Mary still had his jacket. He drove to her house and knocked on the door. An old woman answered. John told her about the ride he had given her daughter Mary and had come back to get the jacket he had lent her. The old woman looked very confused. John noticed a picture of Mary on the fireplace mantel. He pointed to it and told the old woman that that was the girl he had given a ride to. With her voice shaking, the old woman told Jerry that her daughter had been dead for many years and was buried in a cemetery about an hour's drive away from there. Jerry ran to his car and drove to the cemetery. He found his jacket, neatly folded on top of a grave. The name on the gravestone was Mary. In the heart of the forest, a pack of wolves was on the prowl. They had not eaten in days, and their hunger was driving them to desperation. As they moved through the trees, they caught the scent of a nearby village. The villagers had long known about the dangers of the forest and had built high walls to protect themselves. But the wolves were determined, and they found a weakness in the wall, a gap they could squeeze through. Once inside the village, the wolves quickly located their prey. A young couple had recently given birth to a baby boy, and they were unable to resist the temptation of the wolves' hunger. The parents tried to fight back, but they were no match for the pack. The wolves tore into them, leaving their bodies mangled and lifeless on the ground. In the aftermath of the attack, the wolves were still hungry, but the baby boy was left untouched. Perhaps it was out of mercy, or perhaps it was simply because they did not see him as a threat. Whatever the reason, the child was left alone in the forest, surrounded by the corpses of his parents. Hours turned into days, and the child was left to fend for himself. He cried out for help, but there was no one around to hear him. He began to feel the pangs of hunger and thirst, and he knew that he would not survive much longer if he did not find help. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost, the child heard a rustling in the bushes. He turned to face the sound and saw a small deer emerging from the trees. The child had never seen a deer before, but he knew instinctively that it was not a threat. Slowly, the child approached the deer and watched as it grazed on the grass. He tried to reach out and touch it, but the deer was skittish and ran away. The child was disappointed, but he knew that he needed to find food elsewhere. Chapter 4: The Search for Food. The child wandered through the forest, searching for something to eat. He tried to catch fish in the nearby stream, but he had no experience fishing and was unsuccessful. He found some berries growing on a bush, but they were bitter and did not satisfy his hunger. As the days passed, the child grew weaker and weaker. He knew that he needed help soon, or he would not survive. Just when the child was at his lowest point, the wolf pack returned. They had not forgotten about the baby boy, and they saw him as an easy target. The child tried to run, but he was too weak to outrun the wolves. Just as the wolves were about to pounce, a figure emerged from the trees. It was a woman, dressed in animal skins and carrying a spear. She shouted at the wolves, and they hesitated for a moment. The woman was a member of a nearby tribe, and she had been tracking the wolves for days. She had heard about the attack on the village and had come to investigate. When she saw the child in danger, she knew that she had to act. With her spear in hand, the woman faced off against the wolves. She was outnumbered, but she was determined to protect the child at all costs. The wolves circled her, but she held her ground. Just when it seemed like the woman was about to be overrun, a group of hunters from the tribe arrived. They had heard the commotion and had come to investigate. When they saw the woman and the child in danger, they sprang into action. The hunters were skilled fighters, and they quickly dispatched the wolves. The woman and the child were safe, but they were both badly injured. The hunters carried the woman and the child back to their village, where they were given medical treatment. The child was severely malnourished, and it was touch and go for a while, but he eventually began to recover. The woman, who introduced herself as Kaida, had also been injured in the fight. She had several deep cuts and was badly bruised. But despite her injuries, she refused to leave the child's side. As the child's health improved, Kaida became more and more attached to him. She had lost her own child in a similar attack years before and had never been able to have another. She saw the child as a second chance, a chance to have the family she had always wanted. The other members of the tribe were hesitant at first, but they eventually came to accept the child as one of their own. They named him Sora, which means sky in their language, and he grew up among them. Sora thrived in his new home. He learned the ways of the forest from Kaida, who became his adopted mother. He also learned from the other members of the tribe, who taught him about their customs and traditions. As he grew older, Sora never forgot about his parents, but he knew that they were gone forever. He found solace in his new family and in the beauty of the forest around him. Years passed, and Sora became a skilled hunter and fighter. He never forgot the wolves that had killed his parents, but he knew that they were just animals doing what they had to do to survive. He lived his life with respect for the forest and all its inhabitants, and he was grateful for the second chance he had been given. So who is the boy in the castle? Real ghost stories online. Once upon a time, there was a castle nestled deep in the rolling hills of the English countryside. The castle had a rich history and had been passed down through generations of noble families. However, there was one mystery that haunted the castle, a mystery that had never been solved: the mystery of the boy in the castle. The story began over 100 years ago, when the castle was owned by a wealthy family, the Abernethys. The Abernethys had a son named Alexander, who was known to be a bit of a troublemaker. He was always getting into scrapes and causing mischief, much to the annoyance of his parents. One day, Alexander went missing. Despite a thorough search of the castle and its grounds, no trace of him was ever found. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Years went by, and the Abernethys eventually sold the castle to another family. However, rumors began to circulate that the castle was haunted by the ghost of a young boy. People claimed to have seen the ghostly figure of a boy wandering the halls of the castle, and strange noises could be heard coming from the rooms where Alexander had once lived. The rumors only grew stronger as the years went by, and the castle became known as one of the most haunted places in England. Many people tried to investigate the mystery of the boy in the castle, but none were ever successful. One day, a group of paranormal investigators decided to spend the night in the castle, hoping to catch a glimpse of the ghostly boy. They set up their equipment in one of the rooms where the boy was said to have lived and waited for the night to begin. As the sun set and the darkness crept in, the investigators began to hear strange noises coming from the hallway. Footsteps could be heard, but when they went to investigate, no one was there. As the night wore on, the investigators began to feel an eerie presence in the room. They felt as if they were being watched, and the temperature dropped suddenly, causing them to shiver. Suddenly, they heard a child's voice whispering in the darkness. They couldn't make out what was being said, but they knew it was the voice of a boy. Then, out of nowhere, the ghostly figure of a young boy appeared before them. He was pale and translucent, and seemed to be hovering just above the ground. The investigators were terrified, but they managed to capture the ghostly apparition on their cameras. They soon discovered that the ghostly boy was none other than Alexander Abernethy. He had been playing a game of hide and seek when he became trapped in a secret passage. No one had ever found him, and he had died alone in the castle. The investigators were able to put Alexander's spirit to rest, and the castle was no longer haunted by the ghost of the boy. However, the mystery of the boy in the castle had finally been solved, and people could finally put the rumors and legends to rest. From that day on, the castle was no longer known as one of the most haunted places in England. Instead, it became a popular tourist destination, attracting people from all over the world who were curious about the castle's rich history. And as for Alexander, his spirit was finally at peace, knowing that his story had been told and his memory had been honored. Speak of the devil. There was a nun who was on her way to midnight mass one night. She was driving down a lonely country road. It was very dark outside, and she was worried as it was getting late. She kissed the rosary beads around her neck and said a prayer. She glanced at her car radio's clock and saw that it was exactly 12 p.m. When she looked back at the road, she saw a tall, dark figure standing there with his thumb sticking out. She was about to drive past, but she thought she could use some company, so she pulled over to the side of the road. The man walked over to her car and opened the door. He was very tall and thin, and his face was pale white. He wore a huge overcoat and a big black hat. "Do you want a ride?" she asked. He looked down upon her and smiled. "Why, sure. Where are you going?" "I'm heading to church for midnight mass," she said. "Are you going that way?" "Thereabouts," he said as he got into the back seat of the car. "Thanks for stopping. Usually, no one stops for hitchhikers this late at night." The nun smiled and drove on down the road. On the way, she told the man all about her life and her faith. He listened and laughed once in a while. As the church came into view, he leaned forward and asked her to stop. "Are you sure?" said the nun. "I could take you a little farther." As he got out, he replied, "No, I'll be good right here. I'll walk. Actually, I have someone coming for me. Right near this spot." "Are you sure?" she asked, as she had seemed to like his company. "No, but thank you, Clarice, for the ride." He smiled at her and then walked down the road. Then, she wondered. I never told him my name. She got out of her car and looked down at the tracks he left and screamed. Where his footprints were, there was hoof prints. She drove into Busby, arrived at the church, and told the priest about what had happened. She showed him her car, and in the back seat, there was a devil's sign. The next morning, she was found dead in her car, right where she had dropped the hitchhiker off. Tap, tap, tap. I will tell you a story about something terrible that happened on Halloween. This story is true, so they say, and it made my hair stand on end just to hear it. It all happened many years ago in my town, which, at that time, was just a little town between the mountains of Catalonia, Spain. The town was little more than a small square with a church, a park, a prison, and a school, with all the houses clustered around. The town was very proud of their school since it had been voted the best school in the province. It was the morning of October 31st, Halloween, and a class of students were doing arts and crafts in their classroom. Some were cutting skeletons out of sheets of paper, some were painting vampire bats, and others were drawing pumpkins. The students were all aged between 8 and 9 years old. Their teacher was a beautiful young woman who had only been working at the school for 1 month. While the children were having fun, preparing the Halloween decorations, the teacher turned the radio to listen to the weather forecast. She was planning to organize an outdoor Halloween party for the kids later that day and wanted to be sure that it wouldn't rain. Suddenly, the weather forecast was interrupted by a news bulletin. This is an important announcement. A convicted murderer has escaped from the local prison and is on the loose. He is described as armed and very dangerous. Please, do not attempt to apprehend him. The police will. The teacher rushed across the room and switched off the radio. She did not want to alarm the children, but it was too late. The children had all heard the broadcast and were very frightened by the news. They knew that the prison was very near the school. The teacher tried to reassure them and told them not to worry. A few minutes later, the school principal made an announcement over the intercom. Attention all teachers. We have been informed that police are dealing with a very serious situation that is occurring right now in the town. All teachers are advised to lock the doors and windows of their classrooms until the police get this situation under control. I repeat, lock all doors and windows until further instruction. That is all. The teacher told the class to stay calm. She took out her key and locked the classroom door. Then she went around and closed every window, making sure that they were secure and nobody could get in. One little girl raised her hand and asked if she could go to the bathroom. The teacher didn't want to let her go, but the girl insisted. The teacher finally relented and gave her permission to go to the toilet. After all, it was unlikely that the murderer would come to the school. She told the girl that, when she came back, she would have to give a secret knock at the classroom door. Then they would know that it was her and they could let her back in. The code was 3 taps and 2 scratches. Tap, tap, tap. Scratch, scratch. The girl left to go to the bathroom and the teacher locked the door behind her. To take the children's minds off the scary situation, she started telling stories. After 20 minutes had passed and the girl still had not returned, the teacher began to get worried. What's taking her so long? She wondered out loud. Suddenly, they could hear footsteps in the corridor. Everybody in the classroom froze. Then they heard a noise at the door. Tap, tap, tap. Scratch, scratch. She's back, sighed the teacher in relief. She walked over, took out her key. What if it's not her? Asked one little boy who was shivering with fright. The teacher hesitated, her key inches from the lock. Again they heard a noise at the door. Tap, tap, tap. Scratch, scratch. It must be her, said the teacher. She put the key into the door and unlocked it. Suddenly, the classroom door burst open and a tall man was standing there. In his right hand, he was holding a knife and in his left hand, he was holding the little girl's severed head. The escaped murderer came into the classroom, smiling from ear to ear. The children were trapped inside. All that could be heard in the corridors of the school were screams of terror and squeals of pain. In the chaos, the teacher managed to break a window and jump out. She barely escaped with her life and crawled to safety. The children, however, were not so lucky. When the police arrived, they found the murderer sitting in the middle of the classroom. The floor, walls, and ceiling were covered in blood. Little body parts lay scattered around him. He had chopped up every child in the class into tiny pieces. They found the headless body of the little girl in the third stall of the bathroom. The police figured out what had probably happened that cold October day. The escaped prisoner must have been hiding in the toilet when the girl was asking for permission to go to the bathroom. He must have surprised her in the stall and forced her to tell him the password. When she did, he cut off her head. Today, the teacher is in a psychiatric hospital. She never recovered from the incident and can't stop repeating over and over again, tap, tap, tap. Scratch, scratch. Tap, tap, tap. Scratch, scratch. The school was abandoned because parents refused to send their children there. There were too many bad memories. The school was left just the way it was when the murders occurred. They say that if you visit the old school building and go into the classroom, you can still see the blood still dripping down the walls. If you are brave enough, you could even go to the bathroom. Just tap 3 times and scratch 2 times on the door of the third stall. Then open it. You will see the headless body of the little girl sitting on the toilet.